The reading is taken from the book of Numbers, chapter 25, beginning at verse 1. At the time this incident occurs, the Israelites were in the desert after Moses had received the law on Mount Sinai. While Israel was staying in Shittim, the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with Moabite women, who invited them to the sacrifices to their gods. The people ate and bowed down before these gods. So Israel joined in worshipping the Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger burned against them. The Lord said to Moses, "Take all the leaders of these people, kill them, and expose them in broad daylight before the Lord, so that the Lord's fierce anger may turn away from Israel." So Moses said to Israel's judges, "Each of you must put to death those of your men who have joined in worshipping the Baal of Peor." Then an Israelite man brought to his family a Midianite woman right before the eyes of Moses and the whole assembly of Israel, while they were weeping at the entrance to the tent of meeting. When Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, saw this, he left the assembly, took a spear in his hand, and followed the Israelite into the tent. He drove the spear through both of them, through the Israelite and into the woman's body. Then the plague against the Israelites was stopped, but those who died in the plague numbered 24,000. The Lord said to Moses, "Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, has turned my anger away from the Israelites, for he was as zealous as I am for my honor among them, so that in my zeal I did not put an end to them. Therefore, tell him I am making my covenant of peace with him. He and his descendants will have a covenant of lasting priesthood, because he was zealous for the honor of his God and made atonement for the Israelites." The name of the Israelite who was killed with the Midianite woman was Zimri, son of Salu, the leader of a Simeonite family. And the name of the Midianite woman who was put to death was Cosbi, daughter of Zur, a tribal chief of a Midianite family. The Lord said to Moses, "Treat the Midianites as enemies and kill them, because they treated you as enemies when they deceived you in the affair of Peor and their sister Cosbi, the daughter of a Midianite leader, the woman who was killed when the plague came as a result of Peor."
Most of us would appreciate a challenge from time to time, as long as it's not too strong. Well, we have a challenge, Pam and I, this morning. I can imagine Richard Worthington sitting there saying, "Now, it's Pam and Mike this week. What should we give them? A hard time or an easy time? Either Psalm 23, maybe, or Numbers 25. And that's what we ended up with. I'm down. That's the up. Oh, we're there. That's it. Fine. And so, Numbers 25:1. I wonder what you thought as you listened to that passage that Pam read. Of course, within the safe walls of Southfield Church, we could probably think of one or two platitudes to explain what it's all about. But for me, quite frankly, it was horrific. Now, I wonder whether if you go home along the road and you meet your neighbour on the way, and the neighbour says, "Oh, you've been to church. Did you have a good time? What did you study?" Would you have the courage to tell them what we studied? I don't think I would. I think I'd say, well, we had an Old Testament story. And they'd say, "Oh, how nice." And I'd say, "Yes, very nice." Because this passage really is a frightening one. And it raises a lot of questions. Not just for me, but I think for lots of Christians. Questions that maybe they don't articulate because it seems a bit like losing faith to ask questions. But in fact, many Christians are asking in all these passages in the Old Testament, this one and the ones that follow in the book of Joshua, there's all that killing, all that violence. And very often, God is involved, not just allowing it, but actually sometimes instigating it. And the question that many people are asking is, where in all this is the God of love and compassion and mercy? And it is a huge question. And Pam and I, unfortunately, know quite a few people who over the last 10 and 15 years, people who've been Christians all their lives, even missionary, and now as they come into their 60s and their 70s, they're giving up the faith. And one reason, among others, is that these sort of passages they cannot take. They've never had an answer as to why this horrific stuff is in God's Word. And so it's significant these days to be able to think around these things, even if we don't come out with simple answers at the end. So one reason why this is significant is because as Christians we need to think through some of these problems. Now if it's not a problem for you, then forget it. Go to sleep for the next 10 minutes. But for many people this is. Not only are Christians worried by this, but this sort of thing, the violence of the Old Testament, the genocide, the continual violence, the warfare, is very worrying to us, but also it gives ammunition to our enemies. Now, when I was young, we had atheists. Atheists were normally quiet-spoken people who didn't believe in God, and they went through their life without God. Today, we have what we call the new atheists, a new brand, who are quite different. They don't believe in God, and their mission in life is to stop everybody else believing in God. They think that belief in any religion is wrong and harmful. And so today, we're in a conflict situation with atheists who really want to bring down the faith and the church. And probably one of the leading figures that you would think of in this is Richard Dawkins. Very interesting guy, very bright, professor at Oxford, done some brilliant work, and we've listened and read some of his work on evolution, and he is actually a very clever guy. But he's got an awful bee in his bonnet about religion, which doesn't really seem logical, because he loses his logic when he gets into that area. And he is the one who's written numerous books. The most famous is The God Delusion, in which he talks about the reality of the world without God. And he made this statement in one book: the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous, petty, unjust. And he goes on for another 20 adjectives, all getting worse and worse, and I won't show you those. you will be highly offended. Now, why has he got this? Well, very much of this argument is based upon this same question. Why all the violence? Why the genocide in the Old Testament? And he uses that, of course, as his platform from which to attack the whole of Christian faith. Not logically necessarily, but that's his attack. And so we are in a situation then where we're asking this question, why all this violence in the Old Testament? Now, of course, we're not saying that isn't the most wonderful stuff in the Old Testament. In fact, it is the foundation of our New Testament Christianity. And in the Old Testament, God speaks to us wonderfully. He shows his whole plan of salvation. We have lovely poetry, the Psalms for praise and worship. Some wonderful spiritual role models of people who walked with God. And what happened? Examples of prayer, prophecies of the coming Messiah, wise proverbs, and God's love for the whole world, not just the Jewish nation. So the Old Testament is full of wonderful things for us. But in among this, we do have this rather embarrassing question about the violence that we see perpetrated there. And so we have to think about that one and the way forward from there. Now, in fact, there have been explanations. Over 2,000 years, people have tried to explain why is there this violence in the Old Testament. And here are some of them. Marcion. Marcion lived about 140 years AD, 100 years after Jesus. He was the son of a bishop, and he was horrified by the Old Testament violence. He couldn't make any sense of it. So he began to teach a new doctrine, that in fact, the Old Testament is totally separate from the New. Even that the God of the Old Testament isn't the same God as the New Testament. He called him a demigod, that the Old Testament demigod was a very unpleasant character, angry, fearful, violence, fearsome violence. And so he rejected the whole of the Old Testament and took only the New Testament. And in the New Testament, there were bits he didn't like, so he cut them out. And he ended up with a very tiny Bible indeed. And people followed him for a while. And then eventually, the church got together, had a big convocation, and Marcionism was discussed and completely rejected. But that was all about the fact that he was really worried by this same question that we're talking about today. Another explanation is that it's unhistorical. Maybe these things never actually happened. Maybe they're just myths that have come down through Hebrew history, a bit like Robin Hood in our culture, and they never really happened. Another possible explanation has come up. It was a misunderstanding. The Hebrew people went and did all these terrible things, but God didn't really command them to do them. And therefore, he's not responsible. And finally, when we hear about the genocide in Canaan, the killing of whole tribes, then the argument is God never actually said do that. He said drive them out, expel them, not kill them. But actually, when you look at those four, I don't really feel happy with any of those answers. Not the first one, certainly. But unhistorical? Well, here we have history that we can relate to real history. It's all consecutive. Every evidence is we have history here, and that these things did happen. The misunderstanding one, well, all we have to do is look at the text. We see God actually saying, do this, do that. He was actually commanding. And then the expulsion one, well, in fact, that doesn't fit either, because Joshua was told to annihilate certain groups. So, in fact, none of those make sense. Now, I know what you're thinking. Now we want to know the real answer. Well, I won't run away from it, but I think we should go back to the passage for a bit. So let's just look at the passage itself. What happened was Israel had come out of Egypt, across Sinai. They passed through Mount Sinai where the law was given. They headed up into the promised land. And as you know, they didn't get in. They were too frightened. And so as a result, God gave them 40 years of wandering in the desert, and then they came up the east side and they arrived at Moab. And when they got to Moab, they camped there and they appeared to have been welcomed. But the Moabites were terribly afraid of Israel, and they knew its power was a spiritual power. And so they had a go at destroying the spiritual heart of Israel. The first thing they did was to hire, apparently you could hire prophets in those days, so they hired a prophet called Balaam. And you've probably discussed him recently. And Balaam was there to curse Israel, and he didn't do it, and so their plan failed. So instead, the Moabites introduced young women into the camp of the Israelites. And these Moabite women gradually seduced the men and took them away into their towns and into their temples and into their rituals, and they actually began to believe some of the things in that Canaanite theology. It's possible that some of those women were not just any old women, they were actually prostitutes from the temple, because that was a common thing then. So these pagans somehow seduced the men and took them away. And of course, the whole future of Israel hung in the balance. If Israel had lost faith completely in the true God, then God's great plan for history would have been thwarted. And so God had to respond in some way. But why did he respond quite like this? Anyway, let's go back to the question of who was Moab. Well, Moab was actually related to Abraham. Terah had 4 children, and the eldest one, Haran, died quite early in the Bible narrative, so we know nothing about him really. But Haran had a son called Lot, and Lot had 2 sons, Ammon and Moab, who later on became large tribes, unfortunately abandoning the worship of God completely and turning away and becoming enemies of Israel and of the Lord. We won't dwell upon the birth of Ammon and Moab, because it's not the sort of thing you talk about in polite society. But what was the connection, anyway, between Abraham and Moab? What was Moab to Abraham? Grand-nephew. So they were connected very closely, and yet in terms of history and faith, miles apart. And so this was the nation that was living in that area, blocking the way through into Canaan. But they worshipped Baal. And throughout that whole period, we keep hearing about Baal. Who was Baal? Well, Baal is a word that comes in many of those languages in the Middle East. It's there right the way through all those Canaanite languages, and of course it's in the Hebrew. And Baal really means owner, basically, but also lord or master, and even it can mean husband. In the Bible we have it sometimes, even in Hosea, for example, Baal is used for husband. And today in Israel, this word is used for husband. Although my guess is that with increasing feminism in Israel, they probably don't like the word. So Baal was that, but this word was used particularly for the fertility god that was worshipped throughout the region. And so it became a prefix for Canaanite gods, each one attached to a place where it was. And so you've got Hermon, we know Mount Hermon, Baal Hermon, and then in our case, the god that was worshipped in Moab was Baal Peor. Peor is a mountain there. And so these gods, really very similar actually, all across the region, were worshipped with the most awful form of worship. It was just awful and filthy. There was child sacrifice. In many of them, the first child of any couple was sacrificed. There was ritual orgies all across the place. There were temple prostitutes. There was an awful atmosphere there. It was really evil. And that's why God had to do something in this situation as Israel was being dragged into this awful situation. In fact, this is a model of Baal, which comes from just about the period that we read about today. It's probably 200 years later. But it's made of brass, and that was one that would be found in one of the temples a long time ago. Also interesting that the Baal idea was still around in Jesus' day. It didn't die out. People around were still worshipping Baal. And in the New Testament, we have that word Beelzebub in the Greek, which is actually Baal-zebub. And so it's actually still going on, even in the time of the Romans, when Jesus was serving. And he used that term. Actually, it means Lord of the Flies. Does that ring a bell? William Golding. Yeah, his book, Lord of the Flies, which actually is all about the way that a civilized group of young boys could actually revert to paganism. So it all connects up quite well there. So that's the situation that we have. So that's the background. Now you think I'm trying to run out of time, so I don't have to answer the big question, I know. Anyway, here is a possible viewpoint. I wouldn't call it an answer. But Pam and I have struggled with this for years and formed a few ideas. And the viewpoint is, let's start right back at the beginning of creation. There, out of the wonderful universe that God had made, out of the Big Bang where everything began to coalesce, eventually out came our earth. And at first, it wasn't that particular shape because it was covered in water. And then God caused the water to go down, or the land to come up, whichever you like. And the most beautiful things occurred, and mountains came, and he produced the most beautiful creation imaginable. And he loved it. And he said it was good. And it was. And then he covered the ground with flowers. It got even better. And then the high point of God's creation came. And the high point was us, humankind. And that was his incredible achievement on this beautiful earth he'd made. It's all a wonderful story. But when he made mankind, he said something quite different from all the others. From producing the land and the crops and the animals, he said when mankind was created, let us make man in our image, in our likeness. And so God created mankind in his own image. Now that's amazing. Some of the characteristics of the personality of God were put into the man that he'd made. Things like this. Freedom to actually do things. A reasoning ability. Emotions, just like the emotions that God himself has. And of course, love. The ability to love with real love. A love that comes from him. Decision making. And then creativity. Following the Creator in making things. And these people that he made were his wonderful, beautiful creation. It'd be nice to stop on that high point, wouldn't it? But, as you know, it didn't continue. Very soon, it degenerated. And man began to fight. Evil came into the world, and the whole thing seemed to be in a terrible situation. And so that's the situation that we're in. Now, what could God do in the midst of all this violence? Well, he could obviously annihilate man. Then he'd have lost his great creation. He could have taken away his freedom. Then we became puppets. Instead, it seems he began to work within his creation, within the cultures that were establishing, even though they were horrible. In fact, the answer seems to be that God was limited. Now, at this point, I expect some people to leave the room. How can you say God is limited? The eternal creator of the universe, the author of the cosmos. He being limited? How can he be limited? He can only be limited by one means, by his own decree. Because when he made that decree, which it was, let us make man in our own image and likeness, He put all those characteristics into man, and he, in a sense, committed himself to keeping those. So he wouldn't actually come in and interfere with all those wonderful things that he put, because he chose not to. So God actually made concessions, therefore, in the broken world in which man was living. And when God began to interact into that world, then the reality of it was so bad, he had to begin to do things in the way that it was done in those cultures. And this is, as we see it, part of the explanation. God himself was actually living within those cultures, making concessions. Now, it's not only this business of violence. If you look at the Old Testament, he makes concessions to the cultures of the day very often, obviously to keep the freedom of man going. For example, slavery. God obviously hates slavery. The thought that one of his beautiful creations should own another one and abuse that person is obviously anathema to God. And yet, in the Old Testament, he allowed slavery and even gave rules as to how it should be organized. Divorce. God obviously longs for marriages to be lifelong and happy. But in the reality, they do fall apart. Things don't work out. And so God allows divorce and gives instructions in the Old Testament. Adultery. You wouldn't think that a man like David, the greatest king of Israel, would be able to go on serving God after he'd fallen into that. But he did. Drunkenness. Take a look at Samson, whom God used, and a few others too. But God continued to work despite this. Arrogance. Some of those people God used mightily in the Old Testament were very arrogant. And he says that one of the 7 things he hates is arrogance. And, of course, the violence that we're looking at today. Likewise, he worked within the system there and was able to function there, even though he really hated the violence that was going on. Now, that's all a bit somber, isn't it? Sorry about that. It's a lovely day for a somber subject. But in the Old Testament, there was a light at the end of the tunnel. And I invite you just to enjoy the words of Isaiah and let them sort of sink in. For one day, he said, the wolf shall live with the lamb. The leopard shall lie down with the kid. The calf and the lion and the fatling together. And a little child shall lead them. What a lovely picture of peace, calm, harmony. They will not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. There was hope, even in the Old Testament, that one day all this violence would disappear and God's peace would reign. And I rather like that bit when I see a little child to lead them, making friends with a lion. And that's the sort of peace he's talking about there. And when did it happen? Well, it happened really at Bethlehem. Because as we come into the New Testament, I think sometimes we actually underrate Christmas. We make a fuss about a baby in a manger and all that. But this is the most amazing thing in the world. Because instead of God working in the world, he became part of the world. The incarnation is an amazing thing. God himself becoming a man and thereby helping to solve this whole problem. And so the answer lies in Jesus.
Continuing the story of Bethlehem, I'm going to read a short essay, and it's by a person called James Allan Francis. He was a Canadian and a pastor, and he spent his life at the beginning of the 20th century serving God in America. He was born in an obscure village, the child of a peasant. He grew up in another village, where he worked in a carpenter's shop until he was 30. Then, for 3 years, he was an itinerant preacher. He never wrote a book. He never held an office. He never had a family or owned a home. He didn't go to college. He never lived in a big city. He never traveled 200 miles from the place where he was born. He did none of the things that usually accompany greatness. He had no credentials but himself. He was only 33 when the tide of public opinion turned against him. His friends ran away. One of them denied him. He was turned over to his enemies and went through the mockery of a trial. He was nailed to a cross between two thieves. While he was dying, his executioners gambled for his garments, the only property he had on earth. When he was dead, he was laid in a borrowed grave through the pity of a friend. 20 centuries have come and gone, and today he is the central figure of the human race. I'm well within the mark when I say that all the armies that ever marched, all the navies that ever sailed, all the parliaments that ever sat, all the kings that ever reigned, put together, have not affected the life of man on this earth as much as that one solitary life. I wonder what this one solitary life means to each one of you today. For me, the life and teaching of Jesus show me the way to live. Through his death, I can enter the presence of God the Father and kneel at his throne of grace. His death has given me hope for the future.